It's becoming a sort of summer tradition on this channel. It's not really a secret that this is my favorite style of racket, so I love talking about the best in this particular category. It's time for another top 5 best rackets for control. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets and Runners. So this is a video I'm excited to make every year, but particularly this year because I just watched the one from 2024 and there's going to be a lot of changes. We need to have a little conversation about control. It's pretty obvious that things have been changing recently with regards to control, what control actually means, and its importance in the tennis industry as a whole. It's not that control rackets are dying, but the industry standard for what makes a good control racket has definitely changed. Control rackets can't just be all out for control and nothing else anymore. Because of the popularity of hybrid rackets like the Aero 98, the E-Zone 98, the pendulum has shifted towards more power, and it's taken some time, but my perception of what makes a good control racket has definitely changed too. Arguably most importantly though, even professional players are changing their racket preferences. Tons of players have switched rackets this season, and the primary victim has been the control racket. This is a topic I've actually already talked about on this channel. If you haven't seen that video, I'm gonna link it up here. To summarize what's going on, professional players who have been historically much more keen to use control rackets are switching away from classic control rackets to much more modern sticks. The question is why? Do players just not care about control anymore? Or has control shifted from a more classic style of control to this modern control? Now let's just pause for a second because we need to define a very important term that I just used, classic control. What makes up classic control rackets and why have pros or really high level players historically played with them? Classic control rackets are rackets that are designed to optimize 3 important playability characteristics: ball feel, consistency, and precision. Good feel helps you get dialed into a racket so it becomes an extension of your arm. Consistency means that the racket never surprises you, and precision means that the ball is going to go where you tell it to. I'm going to use this Pro Tour 280 as an example of how control rackets are actually designed to optimize those characteristics, because this is pretty much a 10 out of 10 in all of those things. First of all, this racket has a soft, constant, thin beam with a small head size, which gives it good feel, a long dwell time, and then a small but very well-defined sweet spot. Then its consistency comes from, again, that thin beam that has a uniform or consistent flex, but also the very tight string bed and this racket's high static weight. Denser string beds basically neutralize the effect of the strings on the ball. You get less trampoline effect and less string movement, which gives you, the player, more control over what happens to the ball. Then the high static weight provides stability. Stability is crucial to consistency because high stability basically means the racket stays just as rock solid on impact no matter what kind of ball you're receiving or hitting. So those are the typical design characteristics of a control racket. The main issue with those characteristics is that they have an unfortunate but very important side effect. They also all negatively impact power. Thin, soft beams like this soak up more of the ball's energy during dwell time. That lowers power. Small head sizes like this don't push the ball as deep. That lowers power. Dense string beds have less trampoline effect. That lowers power. And heavier rackets are slower to swing. That lowers power. You get it? Historically, high control meant low power. They were almost perfectly negatively correlated to the point where talking about power in a control racket was almost seen as a bad thing. That's the big change that's happened in recent years. Because brands have innovated, because players have found new ways to feel in control, adding power to a racket doesn't necessarily mean it's less controlled anymore. Now, in all fairness, it's taken me a really long time to wrap my head around this. I've always had a soft spot for classic control rackets because I did genuinely believe that those were the rackets that allowed me to play my best tennis. What's changed is that because I'm in this unique position where I get to test pretty much every racket in the industry, I've realized that you don't necessarily need classic control to still feel in control. You can use spin, you can adjust your strings, and nowadays there are many rackets that blend traditional control elements with much more modern playability as well, and I feel just as in control with those as I do with something like this. And with the fact that almost everyone is playing with more powerful rackets nowadays, playing with something this low powered almost does put you at a disadvantage. I'm not gonna say this top 5 is gonna be a bunch of power rackets that I convince you can still control the ball with, but it's not going to be as classic control focused as it has been the last 2 years. We're going to get into number 5 now. This might be one of my more controversial lists. And of course, remember that any of the rackets we talk about today, you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, Follow me in the store on Instagram. Let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. Now let's get into number 5. Coming in at number 5, we have the first big upset, considering this racket was number 1 last year. It's the Yonex Percept 97. Now this racket has slipped for a few reasons. 1, new rackets have come out. 2, rackets it was competing with last year have been replaced and are just that little bit better. And 3, it kind of perfectly represents talking about regarding control. The Percept 97 is one of those rackets that still prioritizes classic control with a few twists here and there that we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, this is a classic control racket. It has a small head size. 97 is kind of the new 95 nowadays. It has a thin 21mm beam, and importantly, that beam is quite traditional. It's a box beam, which means it generates less power than something with an oval or hybrid beam. These design characteristics mean that this racket doesn't have a lot of that more modern playability I was just talking about, but they are also the main reason for why, if you are looking for classic control, this is probably the best option to go for right now. It has incredible precision thanks to the smaller head, and the ball feel here is super clean with really well-defined feedback in and out of the sweet spot. Of course, it does have an isometric head shape, which for me works really well in a 97 because it plays slightly bigger, which makes it more forgiving, but it still has that great precision and fantastic maneuverability. That's another big part of this racket's classic control profile. Making a racket more powerful generally involves making it bigger, whether that's with a bigger head size or a thicker beam. The Percept still has that quickness you want from a classic control racket. And then at 310 grams, the stock stability is pretty good. The swing weight is a little bit low though, so I do recommend adding some weight to the hoop to boost that stability and plow through even more. I do quickly want to go over the modern elements here, but it doesn't have much, especially compared to the next rackets on this list. The only real hint towards modern technology here is the stabilization tech in the hoop, stiff racket face design. This does make the racket a little bit more resilient on off-center hits by increasing the sweet spot size, but it's very minor. On some other control rackets, that modern stabilization tech is much more obvious and in your face, and to be honest, the fact that it is subtle here is part of why I like the Percept so much. Too much of that stabilization tech can be very intrusive on ball feel. Feel is still a huge positive here, and when a racket is this classic in its design and playability, I want good ball feel. So for those of you who are looking for really good classic control, this is the one I would recommend. Now let's move on to number 4. Coming in at number 4, we have a brand new entry into the list and a brand new racket for 2025. The Head Gravity Tour. This is a racket that reviewers and racket nerds were begging Head to release for years, and now that they finally did, we were not disappointed. On paper, the Gravity Tour looks exactly like what you'd expect from a classic control racket. It's soft, it has a 98 square inch head size, a constant traditional beam design that is a little bit thick at 22mm, but this has a very traditional control profile overall. And in terms of playability, those classic control elements are very good here, especially when it comes to ball feel and stability. When you make contact in the sweet spot with this racket, you're rewarded with this really unique booming sound that also feels plush, but very responsive. It nails that addictive factor that players are looking for with control rackets, and it makes you want to hit that sweet spot over and over to get that feedback. That's obviously a huge positive, and obviously good feel has been a key element of the Gravity Tour since they first released it back in 2019, so I'm really happy that they got it right on a 98 square inch version of it, and actually took it to the next level, at least in my opinion. Then, that great stability comes from this frame design, which is also where it gets some of those more modern playability characteristics that I'll talk about in a second, but stability is really the main thing here. The Gravity Teardrop head shape concentrates more mass in the upper hoop, which helps to make it super stable without requiring a really high swing weight. Now let's talk modern playability, because yes, that head shape is the key here. More mass in the upper hoop like this also increases your leverage over the ball, which helps with power and spin. When you swing big and time it right, you are rewarded with a very heavy ball, similar to other rackets that have this more modern head shape, like the VCore 98, the Boom Pro, and the Aero 98. A lot of brands are starting to design rackets like this with more mass in the upper hoop because of those benefits in power, spin, and stability, but the Gravity Tour is the one that does it, but still feels and plays most like a control racket. You do sacrifice a little bit of consistency seeing that softer counter-punchy control, but especially that increase in spin means that as long as you play a modern game style, you can still hit with margin and also generate a heavier ball. The other small issue here is that more mass in the upper hoop does make this racket feel a tiny bit slower. It doesn't have that scalpel-like feel of more classic control rackets like I was just saying with the Percept, but that's honestly a really small sacrifice, all things considered. Consistency and maneuverability is why it's not coming in any higher, but for modern players who play with spin, who still want that more traditional feel from their frame, this is pretty much the best option right now. Okay, so the next three rackets are all incredible frames that are also very different, so ranking them is kind of pointless because if one works better for you, then that's the one you should go with, but I'm gonna rank them anyway. Coming in at number 3, we have the Technofiber T-Fight 305S, and honestly, the only reason it's not coming in any higher is because it's a little bit less control-coded than the other two, but it might be the most well-rounded. This is a phenomenal racket, and the T-Fight 305 in general has been very good throughout its various iterations, but this is just the peak of what I consider a fantastic modern control racket. The control here comes from its 18x19 string pattern, its exceptional feel, and its ridiculously high stability. And I'm just gonna hone in on those things before I talk about why there is more to it than just control. 18 mains, we all know, creates quite a low launch angle and a slightly deader feeling string bed, and that, along with how stable this racket is, means you can whack at the ball without feeling like it's gonna fly. Then you've got the feel, which isn't soft, but it's so clean, so crisp, and that sweet spot is so well defined that this is one of the best rackets out there right now if you're the type of player who likes communication from your frame. Now let's talk about the rest of the playability here, because despite those control elements being very good, this definitely isn't one of those soft, guidey, counter-punchy style of control frames. This is much more of a hybrid. It all comes down to this beam and the flex that it creates. It's a constant beam, but it's not really traditional. It has this very cool blend of an oval beam in the throat and then this half moon shape in the hoop. That half moon shape is basically a combination of an oval beam and a box beam. Oval beams are more powerful, box beams are more controlled, and that's exactly how this racket feels. It has a much more point and shoot feel to it, where there's not a long dwell time that soaks the ball into the strings, but definitely a more responsive power transfer from your stroke into the ball. That beam also helps give it really good spin potential, which again kind of complements that more powerful controlled style of play where you're not slowing down the ball to control it, but following through and using spin for control. The most impressive thing with this T-Fight 305 for me though is how much they've improved it compared to the last one. T-Fights have always had great power, spin, consistency, feel, and stability, but they were also all difficult rackets to use because of their heavier swing weights and higher balance points. This year they widened the beam, like widened it this way, which meant they were able to drastically lower the swing weight and make the balance a little bit more headlight while maintaining that incredible stability. Now, pretty much anyone can swing this thing, and you can generate easier racket head speed with it, which benefits you in pretty much every way, especially for power and spin. There's a reason this new T-Fight has been so well received. It's a very impressive racket that isn't really a true classic control racket, but it's so elite for what modern control has become that it was an easy choice for me to put it in the top 3. So up until pretty much when I started writing this section of the script, I had it in my head that this was going to be number 1, but then I kept thinking about it, and I just think the next racket represents control a little bit better. So coming in at number 2, we have the Babolat Pure Strike 98. Now in preparation for this video, I watched those 2023 and 2024 control racket videos, and the Strike 98 wasn't in either of them, which is honestly kind of criminal on my end, and I honestly don't know why this racket wasn't there. I've always rated this racket highly, with 1 or 2 issues regarding the fact that it is really tough to swing. If you want to watch me go on a rant about that, go watch our last video about underrated rackets, but I've always thought of the Pure Strike 98 as a really good racket. I think the reason I didn't have it in the top 5 rackets for control is that this racket doesn't necessarily feel like a super traditional control racket, but honestly, that's kind of a good thing. The big thing here is that this racket doesn't have a constant beam. All of the other rackets on this list do, and while I don't think you need a constant beam to be a control racket, it does help with that consistency and feel I keep talking about. This doesn't have the most pure feel ever, but I'm still very connected to the ball. It gives me feedback in the string bed, and the feel is good enough for me to still have some of that addictive factor, which I do need from a control racket. But in terms of consistency, well, this is one of the most solid, trustworthy rackets on the market right now. Part of that is due to its weight. It does have a really heavy swing weight, so it's super stable, but it's also got just a super consistent launch angle. That goes for both the 1820 and the 1619. I think if you want to optimize flat control, definitely go for the 1820, but there's nothing launchy or wild about the 1619 either. Now let's talk about that slower counter-punchy control, because this is another one of those rackets that isn't the best for it, but I do think it's a little bit more capable than the T-Fight and the Gravity Tour, just not quite on the level of the Percept and the #1 racket on this list. I understand that's still important to some people, but again, I'm putting less emphasis on that this year and more on its modern control profile. And when it comes to power and spin, this thing is insane. Honestly, in terms of power potential, this is up there with the EZO 98 and the Aero 98, rackets with much more modern, rigid designs. Now, again, the swing weight helps with that, but this design is more powerful than average for a control racket. That's what you get with a non-constant beam. A big boost in frame rigidity, which transfers power very efficiently, but in the case of the Pure Strike, that comes at the expense of so little feel and control. Spin is also way higher than on those flat beam control rackets, which is par for the course, but that just means that controlling those powerful shots just comes naturally with that added spin. So this is definitely more of a big hitting ball strikers control racket, hence the name, but if that's you, if you can handle the 330 plus swing weight, and you do still want some of that counter punchy safety blanket potential, the Strike is such a gem. Now wait a second, before we talk about #1, and I'm sure a lot of you, knowing me, know what's coming, you probably started doing some math there around #2 and you thought, wait a second, something's gonna be missing here. There's no Wilson Blade on this list, and I do want to explain why, but I also want to make it clear that I don't think the Blade is a bad racket. I just think the Blade is in a slightly weird spot at the moment, where it's trying to be modern with these layup techs that open up the sweet spot, make the racket a bit more powerful, make it faster, but it's not quite modern enough and it's not quite classic enough. It's not got enough power and spin to compete with something like the new Gravity Tour, for example, and it's not classic enough to compete with the Percept or the next racket I'm going to talk about. Really, that comes down to its feel. If you're going to lack power, you need to have some nice classic feel, and while the Blade is soft and fairly plush, it's more of a muted, mushy feel. I know some people do like the feel of the current Blade, but it's just not quite connected enough to be a truly elite classic control racket. And I do quickly want to talk about the Solinco Whiteout, because we got them in, and while I do think this is a very good racket, I'm still not quite yet convinced that it's top 5 for control. To be fair, I haven't played with it all that much, but in stock form, it definitely lacked some stability and feel. I know they muted the V2 a little bit, but the stability, I'm going to try and play around with various customizations, and I will get back to you with what I kind of find is the sweet spot here. Otherwise, it's really impressive. It has those modern elements of power and spin that I'm looking for, so it's definitely an honorable mention, and I will try to make a video, maybe comparing it to the Blade or something like that. But now let's move on to #1. I don't think this is going to come as a surprise to many of you. It did get dethroned last year, but now it's back to #1. It's the Head Gravity Pro. This racket ticks all the boxes for what you want in a modern control racket in 2025. And the reason I say all the boxes is that yes, it's got that modern playability I keep harping on about, but it's also got super good classic playability. The standout features of the Gravity Pro are stability, feel, and precision. Exactly what I said earlier makes up good classic control. It has a buttery soft and consistent 20mm beam, so it's as addictive and flexy as any other racket on the market right now. Then somehow, even though it is a 100, I have never thought I wanted a smaller sweet spot for more accuracy or precision, the way a lot of other 100s do make me feel. And then the stability is just off the charts. This teardrop head shape, combined with its fairly heavy 315 gram static weight, makes it probably the most solid racket on the market right now. At least it's the racket that I always pick up and think, oh yeah, a pro could play with this, no problem. You've got everything else for classic control too. It's got a super consistent, fairly low launch angle thanks to this 18x20 string pattern. Then, because it has a super thin beam, which is becoming less common nowadays, this is actually a racket you feel like you can slow down, let the ball sink into the strings, and guide it into the court. With the last 3 rackets, I said you can do that, but they're not ideal for that style. But this and the Percept are elite rackets if you're still playing with that more traditional counter-punchy game style. Now, with all that said, the most impressive thing about the Gravity Pro for me is that it has all that classic control, but I never feel like it's lacking modern elements, especially power and spin. I never feel like this racket is dated in any way. That's part of the magic of a 100 square inch racket. It does help you hit the ball a little bit harder than rackets with smaller head sizes, And also, while this does have that 18x20 string pattern, it's not quite as dense as other 1820s. You get that extra string movement here, and as long as you string it up with either a sharp poly for some more bite or a slick poly for some more snapback, you won't feel like you're bottoming out at spin potential, at least if you're not used to super spinny frames. I'm not saying this is a spin monster, but it does feel like it still complements a modern spin-friendly game style pretty well, much better than something like a Prestige Pro or the Pro Tour 280 that I was talking about earlier. Now, it's not a perfect racket. I don't think everyone should just go out and buy a Gravity Pro, and the main reason for that is that it is quite difficult to use, and this head shape, weight, and head size does make it a little bit clunky. Easy racket head speed is not this racket's forte, and generating racket head speed is very important for modern tennis. Now, good players can still do that here, but I would still say this is an exclusively advanced player's racket. To be fair, Head has really been focusing on trying to make this racket easier to use since the original 360 Plus, and the big change this year was lowering the swing weight, making the balance a little bit more head light, which does make it quite a bit faster than the previous two. Still, it's definitely not a fast racket, so that's the big drawback here, and that's why, despite how much I like this, I'm not saying it's a perfect racket. So there you go. I can still be a little bit objective about the Gravity Pro. But yeah, that wraps up this top 5 control rackets video. I feel like this is going to be a controversial one. No blade feels almost sacrilegious, but hey, that's the competitive racket world we live in nowadays. With that said, that is going to be the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo any of the rackets I talked about here today, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.